Open a container of blue cheese and the smell alone can clear a room. Go even further and crack open a can of surströmming and people will literally call the police, thinking something died in the building. Durian is banned from hotels, subways, and airports across huge parts of Asia because the smell is that overpowering. And yet millions of people pay good money to eat all three of these on purpose. Your nose exists for one reason: to keep you alive. Every smell your brain registers gets run through the same ancient filter. Is this safe or is this going to kill me? Rotting meat smells bad because rotting meat is dangerous. Spoiled milk smells sour because spoiled milk carries bacteria that can put you in a hospital bed. This system has kept mammals alive for over 200 million years, and it still works exactly the way it's supposed to in almost every situation you'll ever face. Except when you're holding a wedge of Roquefort. Then for some reason the alarm goes quiet and your brain tells you to keep eating. So let's start with what's actually happening in that cheese. Blue cheese gets its smell from a mold called Penicillium roqueforti, the same family of mold that gives us the antibiotic penicillin. As the mold grows through the cheese, it breaks down fat molecules and produces compounds with names like methyl ketones. Those are the exact same compounds your nose associates with decay. Chemically, a ripe blue cheese and a rotting piece of food are triggering some of the same receptors in your nasal passage. Your brain just isn't reacting to it the same way. Now compare that to surströmming, the fermented Baltic herring that regularly gets ranked as the worst-smelling food on the planet. The fish is packed in barely enough salt to slow bacterial growth, then left to ferment for months. That process produces hydrogen sulfide, the same gas that comes off rotten eggs, along with propionic acid and butyric acid, which are also found in, among other things, human vomit and rancid butter. Airlines have banned the cans from checked luggage because the pressure change during flight has caused several of them to explode. But some people in Sweden open these on purpose, at the dinner table, with their families, and enjoy them. And then there's durian. Researchers at the German Institute of Food Technologies once ran a full chemical breakdown of the fruit's odor and found something remarkable. It contains a mix of compounds that individually smell like rotten onions, sulfur, sewage, and skunk spray, all fused together into a scent so distinct that Singapore built dedicated storage lockers for it because the smell would seep through walls in ordinary buildings. Some people describe the taste as custard mixed with almonds. Others describe it as eating next to an open sewer. Both descriptions are apparently correct. So here's the actual question. If your entire olfactory system evolved to protect you from exactly this kind of smell, why does a huge portion of the human population actively seek it out? The first part of the answer is fermentation itself, and it's older than agriculture. Long before humans understood bacteria, they understood that leaving food alone under the right conditions made it last longer and, eventually, taste different. Fermented foods appear independently across almost every culture on Earth. Kimchi in Korea, natto in Japan, sauerkraut in Germany, fish sauce across Southeast Asia, cheese across Europe. Each of these developed separately, often thousands of miles apart, with no shared origin. That's not a coincidence. That's humans repeatedly discovering the same trick, that letting microbes break food down first makes it easier to digest, more nutrient-dense, and often safer to eat over long periods without refrigeration. In other words, the smell we now associate with these foods used to be a signal of something genuinely useful, not danger, preservation. But that still doesn't explain why the smell itself became something people crave rather than something people simply tolerate. And for that, you have to look at what's happening inside your mouth, not your nose. Smell and taste are not the same sense, even though your brain blends them together into one experience. Most of what you think you're tasting is actually retronasal olfaction, smell traveling up through the back of your throat while you chew. Researchers have found that when this pathway is blocked, foods with strong aromas taste almost nothing like themselves. This means the overwhelming, sometimes offensive smell hitting your nose from the outside is only half the story. Once that same compound reaches your mouth and travels up through the back of your throat instead, your brain can interpret it completely differently. This is part of why people who find durian repulsive from a distance sometimes describe the actual eating experience as rich, sweet, and almost creamy. There's also a simpler explanation sitting underneath all of this, and it comes down to exposure. A landmark study on food preference published decades ago found that unfamiliar smells trigger stronger disgust responses than familiar ones, almost regardless of what the smell actually is. Infants raised in households that regularly eat fermented, pungent foods show far less aversion to those smells later in life than children raised without that exposure. Disgust, it turns out, is partly learned. You're born cautious of unfamiliar smells in general, and blue cheese either becomes familiar to you early or it doesn't. This is also why the exact same food can be a delicacy in one country and grounds for a complaint in another. Durian is a billion-dollar industry in parts of Southeast Asia and a banned substance on public transit in the same region. Surströmming is a national dish in parts of Sweden and has literally been the subject of lawsuits from neighbors claiming property damage from the smell in other countries. The chemistry of the food never changes. What changes is what your brain was taught to expect the first few dozen times it encountered that smell. But familiarity alone still doesn't cover everything, because plenty of adults who grew up nowhere near blue cheese or durian still end up loving them later in life, sometimes after actively disliking them the first time they tried it. And that points to something stranger going on. Humans appear to be one of the only species that can learn to enjoy a sensation their body is actively warning them about. We do it with spicy food, which triggers real, measurable pain receptors. We do it with the burn of strong alcohol. We do it with the sourness of unripe fruit turned into something like a sour candy. And we do it with smell. Researchers who study this call it benign masochism, the enjoyment of a sensation your body is registering as unpleasant once your brain has confirmed there's no actual danger attached to it. The fear response fires, and almost immediately behind it, your brain flags the situation as safe, and something about that combination, threat followed immediately by safety, produces a kind of pleasure response that calmer, safer foods simply can't generate. A plain cracker will never make your brain light up the way a wedge of properly aged Roquefort does, because the cracker never asked your brain to overcome anything. There's an economic layer to this too, and it's not subtle. Aged, fermented, pungent foods are almost always more labor-intensive and time-consuming to produce than their bland equivalents. A wheel of blue cheese takes months of careful aging and controlled humidity. Traditional surströmming production is a months-long fermentation process passed down through specific families and companies. Durian trees can take years before they produce fruit, and the fruit itself can only be harvested in narrow seasonal windows. Scarcity and effort have a long history of turning into status, something that most people find repulsive on first contact, but that a smaller group has learned to genuinely crave becomes a marker of refinement almost by default. Liking blue cheese isn't just a taste preference in a lot of social contexts. It's a signal that you've developed a palate other people haven't. Put all of that together, and the picture becomes less about any single explanation and more about several systems overlapping at once. Your nose evolved to protect you from decay, and fermentation happens to produce compounds that sit right next to decay on a chemical level, close enough to trigger the same alarm. Culture and early exposure decide whether that alarm gets reinforced for life or slowly rewired into comfort. Your mouth and throat process the same compound differently than your nose does. So eating the food and smelling the food from across the room are not really the same experience. And your brain, for reasons we still don't fully understand, seems to enjoy pulling back from the edge of disgust more than it enjoys never approaching that edge at all. So the next time you watch someone happily eat a cheese that smells like a locker room, or order a dish that clears out a subway car, you're not watching someone with a broken sense of smell. You're watching a 500-million-year-old warning system get quietly overridden by culture, chemistry, and a brain that, for some reason, finds the edge of danger a little bit delicious.